All right, hello everyone. You're listening to Castbitten, a Dungeon Synth podcast, and I'm the host Trev. And on the show today, we've got the spectacular Wayne, who is really prolific. Wayne is responsible for Dungeon Synth projects Willow Tea, Gnornian, the Orb Weaver, Fjældmark, and my best bet here, Reväwbrø. And what we talked a little there. We'll dive into the pronunciation, but yeah, a ton of really great projects. The song that you just heard in the intro, that's a Willow Tea song. That track is called Salmon Kepseln from the album Jaraziten, if I'm getting that right. But I really like that one. It feels pretty just intensely emotional. Like I listen to it and I just feel like I can want to collapse under all of the weight that it's bearing down on me. It's really nice. I'm excited to dive into that track and album. So yeah, welcome to the show, Wayne. I'm so happy to get you on the horn here.
Thank you for having me, Trev. Yeah, likewise. It's lovely to be chatting with you.
So I want to jump ahead because you hinted at it. It seemed very juicy. So your project, I'll say Reväwbrø.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned the pronunciation there. There's a bit of some background there. The project itself is really cool. It seems like you've got this I don't know, gritty synthy take on dungeon synth, but like almost from a like with the cover art, I'm thinking of like a Lost at Sea type of sound.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
was. So the name. I think the words I used earlier were that it's deliberately awkward to pronounce, and part of it is about the and the short answer is there's no correct way to pronounce it.
Wonderful.
It was it's a little bit of a joke, let's say a little in joke for myself, because the name Reväwbrø. See, I can't even pronounce it myself.
Makes me feel a little better.
Yeah, it uses two letters that don't exist in any language together. So like the A with the dots, the umlaut, that's quite common in Germanic languages. The O with the strike through it is common in, I think it's in Norwegian and maybe Icelandic.
Oh.
But never the twain shall meet. So it's like a little... let's say an orthographic joke, a lame orthographic joke on my part.
No, that's great, and that's stylistically fitting. I feel like Dungeon Synth is this weird meeting of medieval and Renaissance styles with synthesizers. So I don't know, it feels nice there. Were you thinking of anything symbolic when you were putting that together, or was it totally just for the laughs?
A little bit. So with this project, which was just a one shot, I wanted to do, let's say, a little bit of world building, because there's so many good dungeon synth artists, let's say, who are exploring world building within the context of their music. Like Erang is obviously the big example of somebody who does that. And I like the fantasy aspect. So I just sort of imagined a miserable little island in the North Sea, somewhere between Iceland and Norway, that just nobody wants to live there, but they do, and everyone's just sort of desperate to get out. So it was sort of I wrote a very tiny little, let's say maybe an essay, I think it is. I think
Sure.
I included it on Bandcamp, just describing a little bit about the life of the people who live in the port of Reväwbrø. And that's sort of where it all came about. And it certainly has a very nautical flavor that was
Right.
sort of what I was going for.
Oh man, there's so many directions I want to take this based on that response. Can only pick one at a time. But so I see for that you have we'll say a pretty deliberate idea of the identity behind the music. It sounds like before you even made the music. Is that consistent for all of your projects, or am I misreading it there?
Not all of my projects. So some of them I have very deliberate sort of intentions before I start, in terms of, let's say, oh gosh, that's a good question, actually. I think all of them have, I was talking to somebody recently about this, about the idea of putting boundaries around things so that you have a sandbox to play in. So instead of just saying, I have open horizons and I'll do everything, like for me, if I say, I'm not going to put your boundaries on this, I would just sort of freeze with indecision because there's too many choices. So
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and probably the best way that I work is when I do. Oh, sorry, I hope you can't hear my chair creaking. I find that I work better when I put boundaries around things and just say, okay, this is the little square I'm going to work in, and this helps me sort of focus and channel and find how I'm going to approach things and what I sort of put out into the world. So for Orb Weaver, it was Orb Weaver, Reväwbrø. That was very specific about what I wanted to do, and so I picked a very specific set of sounds to sort of work with, and just sort of tying it into this little story about this miserable island. I mean, with Gnornian as well, the other more recent project that I worked on, that again was a sort of an attempt at world building on let's say a slightly larger scale.
Right.
But also drawing from different influences. So, but for things like Willow Tea, for instance, that is more about the tool set and the approach rather than the, let's say, the meta sort of aspect. So like there's no sort of narrative aspect to Willow Tea. It's more about my little sandbox includes a set of tools, and sometimes I'll throw in different tools. I'll throw a few things out and take that approach. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and I guess first off, I can't agree enough about setting restrictions. I love the way that you phrase that, of building a sandbox that you can play within. That's as an artist myself, I think that's one of the things that I've been learning the most along the way. You can like hone out such a more deliberate identity when you set conceptual boundaries, or as you mentioned, tool-based boundaries, like what sounds you'll limit yourself to. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of something that I discovered worked for me better. Like maybe I was listening to your podcast with Disquieting. Avery.
Avery.
And he was talking about going to art school. I'm like, okay, this is interesting, because I also went to a visual arts school many years ago, and one of the courses that I took was called "What Are the Limits of Painting?" So, and it was. With all respect to the class and the teachers and the students, it was the worst class I ever took, because it was like,
oh no,
it was literally a sit down and just let your imagination take you away with it. And I'm like, oh God, I don't know what to do. And I think I went to maybe 3 classes, and then I just couldn't go back to that, because it was just too. It's just too broad to say something like that. So
yeah, I can completely understand that. And again, now I have so many places I want to go with the interview. I feel like we should dwell on that a little bit. Can you talk about your time at art school and how it influenced like your approach to music now, maybe, and some of the pros and cons, some takeaways that you feel like you left with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was never an art student. Like, I wasn't the kid in high school who spent all my lunchtime in the art studio just throwing paint on paper or anything like that. So
I see. Yeah.
I came to art school from a different sort of angle because in one of my many, let's say, sort of educational cul-de-sacs, I decided that I wanted to be a graphic designer. And so I did a year of graphic design school. I didn't really like it that much because it felt too restrictive, because it was very much about you have a brief that you need to complete for a client. And so it was very vocational sort of oriented, very client oriented. And it drove me around the bend a little bit. So I thought, maybe I want to be an artist. Maybe that's what I want to do. And so I shifted focus and I went to art school and I wanted to do digital art. And the first semester was studio orientation, I think they call it, where they take you through each of the different disciplines. So the 3D disciplines, the 2D disciplines, and then the second semester is about focusing on what you want to do from there. So exploring a little bit of ceramics, a little bit of sculpture. And what I actually fell into was darkroom photography. So that's probably the most useful skill to have these days, I think, in the employment market, is to have to know how to set up a darkroom and use analog photography. So I sort of went down that path and I had a great time exploring all that. I mean, I'm a terrible photographer, but it was just as an intellectual and a creative exercise. It was just a lot of fun. And when I got to my second, so I went down this visual arts path, and I was just going with the flow and just enjoying it. And then in the second year, there was a project called, a class called, I think it was just called Digital Project. And it was very open-ended. So I probably should have seen that as a warning sign. But I was listening to a lot of dark ambient and industrial music at the time. And I thought, well, there's nothing in this that says that it has to be visual art. There's nothing in it that says it needs to be, let's say, visual or sort of tactile art in any way. So why don't I just do something I'm interested in and just do something to do with music? And so I just decided I was going to do, I think the proposal for my project was something ridiculous, like exploring 3D space through music. It was just something, it was very art school sort of oriented thinking.
Right. And how did they respond to that?
They just said, go for it. And I'm like, okay.
Oh man.
Yeah, so they just sort of greenlit it, and I had to figure out what to do from there. So I ended up doing a 20-minute 5-track, let's say, EP, I guess. It does exist, but it's not online. Of just ambient explorations, let's say. So a lot of things like using, I remember one of the tracks was just me reciting from emergency resuscitation instructions from the phone book. And layering that over and over. And at the same time, I had this, I think it's called like an Irish tin whistle. It's like a little brass whistle that has maybe 6 holes in it. And I'm a terrible musician. I'm very uncoordinated, but it doesn't stop me.
For sure, I would never guess.
Yeah. So, and the other track in that was just me sort of hitting half notes on this. So that sort of half whistling sound that sort of marks you out as a bit of an amateur at playing a whistle. And I mean, that was the track. And there were several others as well, mostly using that whistle and some other things that I just sort of recorded on the fly. And I think I ended up getting the best result of my entire academic career for this. So I guess it sort of worked out in the end.
Yeah, and was that your first foray into like recording and somewhat releasing music?
Um, Sort of. Well, yes and no. I mean, I went to high school in the 90s, and so a lot of the things that were happening in popular music were, we went from hair metal in the 90s in the 80s, and sort of very overproduced pop music to, it suddenly became very accessible and achievable to be three people in a room just playing music and
Yes,
getting on the
yeah.
radio. Um, so probably around 12 or 13, I picked up guitar. Again, very terrible guitarist, even so long afterwards. And yeah, so I tried my hand at writing music and things like that, and it was just awful four chord rock, Nirvana. Just say Nirvana ripoffs, and
Sure.
yeah. But around maybe when I was about 18 or 19, I started exploring, just out of boredom, exploring the sound recording software that we had on this computer that my dad got for work. And that was sort of the first time I started making music. But yeah, I'd never released anything until maybe a few years ago.
Oh, interesting. Everything, so aside from just being a very interesting story, everything that you said with that whole uh, art school trip, it feels like it makes complete sense after listening to your music.
Mm-hmm.
That just so much of it adds up. I feel like you have you're very creatively minded. You're not just making music. You're like the way that you're building worlds, or at least thinking of like this city on the sea and the people in it and what's going on. It's definitely a step past just writing the music. And when you say that you were really interested in the like analog photo development in dark rooms, I feel like that's such a mix of being creative but also having like a physical technical skill with something, that I can just see
Yeah.
that transposing into making music with synthesizers and computers. It just makes total sense,
Okay.
at least from my point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly very. Um, I mean, I have a lot of mixed feelings about my time at art school. Like I went to art school with the idea that I was going to um, learn how to draw the anatomy and things like that. And it was at the time it was all about how to be very conceptual and things. And like a lot of the people who I went to school with there came from a very art school, like an art in a high school sort of
Right.
background, so they had those fundamentals. So a lot of it, they just didn't focus on the fundamentals. They focused on, okay, so now you've just finished high school and now you're on the Picasso path and you're going to completely revolutionize art by creating your own style. Go for it. Go off and be wonderful. Yeah, again, I think it keeps coming back to that idea that I always feel that again, you need to have boundaries. You need to be able to put things in place, but I think you also need to have in a sense, you need to have a little bit of a fundamental understanding of how to do things
it's
as well.
it's interesting because Avery from Disquieting, the episode that you mentioned, I believe maybe 4 or 5, he had the same takeaway. He said that it was art school was very conceptual, and he felt like maybe there wasn't enough attention to the actual process of making art, to the technical side of it. So,
Yeah,
and it's interesting with you mentioned going to high school in the '90s, so I think that you're a few years ahead. Yet you have the same takeaway. I don't
yeah,
know. I think there's a lot there.
yeah, for sure. I mean, taking Picasso as an example, he didn't just sort of graduate from a prestigious university, and suddenly he invented cubism and turned modernism upside down or anything like that. I mean, he has a very sound technical basis for everything, and it took time to develop this the cubist style. I mean, not saying he's 100% responsible for this, but you know what I mean. It's like
sure, it's not all conceptual.
Yeah, you can't just arrive at the end point without doing a little bit of the without having the basics.
Right, and I think you absolutely see parallels there in music as well. I especially see it with younger artists. They're so excited to get something out there, and they have big ideas, but they maybe they're not able to fully realize their work because they don't have like the critical handle on using their tools, whether it's like writing music or even now with audio workstations, there's like a skill set to that alone.
Yeah.
It's important to get your fundamentals, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd never really worked with an audio workstation before until Willow Tea was actually the first time that I'd used anything like that. And
oh, really?
Yeah. So I left a job a few years ago, and on a whim, I just decided I was going to see if I could buy my laptop, my work laptop, which was a Mac, and I still have it now. And as a Mac, it comes installed with GarageBand.
Right.
And for a few years, I just sort of ignored it. And then, I tried a few times. I'm like, I've got no idea how to work this. Like, what do I even do? How do I make a note? How do I make a sound with this thing? And, actually sitting down and working on when I sort of had the idea to work on this particular sort of project, which evolved into Willow Tea, it was partly just driven by a desire to learn how to use an audio workstation like GarageBand.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot
I can relate there.
Yeah. So a lot of Willow Tea is just about me exploring and discovering this piece of software and trying to make it work to work for me and make it do what I need it to do.
And do you think that fundamental background with Willow Tea of exploration and almost doing it for yourself and see what you can come up with, do you think that that's responsible for the I guess you could say like the less firm direction that it takes compared to like Gnornian or I've already forgot how you pronounced it, Reväwbrø. Those ones being very firmly planted in like self-created lore, whereas Willow Tea is, as you describe it, I think it's melodies for imaginary silent films and sad children that leaves yourself a little bit of wiggle room.
Yeah.
Do you think that that fundamental level of exploration working with Willow Tea, is that responsible for that?
Yeah, definitely. I think my whole sort of approach to Willow Tea was always about discovery, exploration, and sort of, let's say, pushing myself a little bit to learn how to do something properly. And so the sort of kernel that sort of grew the seed for Willow Tea was just I'd heard about Comfy Synth, and I'd never bothered to actually listen to any of it. Like I heard a lot of the let's say the discourse around Comfy Synth, and so I'd never really bothered to sit down and listen to it, but I thought, I wonder if I can make something that sort of fits what maybe I wasn't thinking about this so consciously, but just sort of saying, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to make some comfy synth, and without really knowing what comfy synth sounded like. So the first time I sort of sat down was I just made something that sounded, I guess, what I thought sounded really pretty.
I see.
And I had a basic sort of concept, and I think I initially called it Marsupial Synth, and it was going to be I was going to call it 3 quals, and a qual is like a little it's a I guess the closest analog in nature is that it's similar to a cat, like a little marsupial cat. So it has a pouch. They only live in Australia and I think in New Guinea, and
I see.
They were a big sort of feature of a period of my life, let's say, when I worked in the Parks and Wildlife Service in Tasmania, and I just thought this is a cool sort of concept. Let's just go with this, and I'll call it 3 quals. And I ended up
I love
scrapping.
that.
I ended up scrapping it altogether because I just thought I came up with a different sort of approach. But that song still sits on a hard drive somewhere, waiting to see the light of day because it's stylistically quite different. But so I guess I sort of, with Willow Tea, I gave myself a very big sandbox to play in. All I said was like I wanted to make it melodic. I wanted to use it to explore composition and melody and harmony and counterpoint, things that I didn't really know so much about, and also to teach myself how to use GarageBand, and that's sort of where it went with it. And then when it came time, I didn't sort of consciously do this, but when I sort of sat down and started making what became Reväwbrø, so the Gnornian album that I released with Fjældmark, that had I already sort of had, let's say, the fundamental sort of structures I needed to be able to make things successfully with GarageBand. So I sort of knew what I was doing by the time I got to that point. And I think with Willow Tea, there's a lot of things that I have sitting on hard drives that show that sort of progress from very simple or basic or let's say even just very unsuccessful sort of avenues that I went down. By the time I got to Gnornian, I felt a little bit more sort of confident in what I was doing, and that confidence sort of allowed me to take that extra step of having that extra layer of world building, let's say.
Before we leave Willow Tea, I want to wrap it up back to that album and that first track that I shared. The track is Sammen Kepseln from the album Jaren I believe.
Yeah, it's German.
So
yeah, so it's
right, it's German.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about the translations in a moment, but I think after all of what we just talked about your conceptual approaches to the different albums, I do see on an album by album basis, Willow Tea, the album will kind of stick to a concept, and I think that this Jarasiten one is a good example of that. So you've mentioned that the album name translates to was it, I believe
the seasons,
the seasons, and then that final track is Seed Capsule, and looking into it, it seems like the other tracks are named after the seasons. I thought that was interesting to cover the seasons, but then to end with this big weighty track that it feels to me a little more symbolic. You've talked about the seasons on their own, then a quick like a reprise of one, then Seed Capsule. That's something. Well, I'll allow you to talk about why you named it that. Maybe what kind of symbolism you were thinking of.
Yeah, I think so contrary to what I just said about all the non-conceptual sort of aspects of Willow Tea, this was each album does have its own sort of loose sort of concept, or like I sort of like to think of it as like a little self-contained silent film or movie sort of world, which is why I do call it why I have that description on Bandcamp. And I mean, for instance, the Iris River, the first thing that I released with Willow Tea was about memories of driving through the highlands of Tasmania and crossing a certain place, a sort of a landmark let's say a milestone on my journey was to cross the Iris River. It's just a small river, little mountain stream. It's not that spectacular, just a very pretty place. So it was very much about, let's say, sort of mountains and highlands, and specifically sort of inspired by Tasmania. With Jarostzeiten, that's I wanted to.
I wasn't even close. What was I?
That's okay. I'm sure there's probably German speakers in the world who probably find my pronunciation awkward enough.
Okay, there's some reassurance there at least.
But that one, I wanted to sit down. I want to think about the seasons in a different way. So, you know, when people write things about the seasons, they generally sort of think of summer as being a nice, positive, bright time of year, and winter as being sort of a time of, you know, for a lot of people, it is a time of sadness or a time of sort of rugging up on the couch and just sort of, you know, surviving through winter. And I that's not my experience of the seasons. Like, I'm a cold weather person, and so for me, autumn and winter tend to be the times of year that I enjoy the most in terms of the weather and the seasons and what's sort of happening outside. And I tried to reflect that a little bit in each of the individual tracks. So I wanted to give them each an individual flavour, a different sort of feeling, and hopefully sort of reflecting my sort of feelings about the seasons. So each of them have their own character.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with you there. I'm the same way. I grew up in the southern U.S. and moved up to the very far north, and it's interesting making art if it's relating to the seasons there, because I'm the same. The winter is my happy time, and I think of winter and I think of all the good feelings I have, and I think of summer, all of the negative feelings, and it's not that black and white, but right, if I approach seasons through art, I kind of have the same takeaways there.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, in certainly, my experience has been very similar in that regard. In that, growing up in Australia, you know, even in Tasmania, which has a reputation for being a little bit cold, it's not that cold. I used to just suffer through summer. I used to hate it. Like, it was, you know, and particularly, I lived on the mainland in Melbourne for a year before I moved to Germany, and you know, summer to me was always December through to February, and I arrived in Melbourne in February, and we had over 35 degrees. I think that's maybe about 90 plus Fahrenheit.
Too much.
For 3 weeks straight. And I was just to use that word again, I suffered through it. And coming to Berlin, so I left Berlin, I left Melbourne in December at the height of summer. Let's say the early sort of part of summer, when it's still not so bad, but I mean, it still gets over 30 degrees every day. And the next time I got off the plane here in Berlin, it was actually snowing, and it was about -5. And I'm like, this is perfect. Like, this is home.
Right, it's perfect.
Yeah, so my sort of concept of the seasons has also been influenced, like you sort of said about living in the south of the US and moving to the north. For me, from the tropical dusty climes of Australia to the extremely temperate life in Berlin has definitely had an influence on that. But just sort of coming back to what you said about Samenkapseln and where that sort of fits into things. So the way I sort of structured that whole release, so I had 4 songs for each of the seasons. And then I had one called Herbst, Slight Return, I think. So,
right.
Yeah, my 12-year-old Jimi Hendrix fan me, he was very happy with that bit. But that echoes the melody that I used in Herbst, the first track, but sort of stripped down a little bit. And so I wanted to sort of echo back, like the seasons continue, they keep on rolling on. They might be a little bit different every time. And then Samenkapseln actually came outside of that process of writing that album, but it felt thematically that it was there, like it was about, I guess, the new growth
Right.
that sort of happens. So, and that felt natural for me to sort of put that within the context of that album, because the seasons aren't obviously just about cloudy days, rain, snow,
Right.
days at the beach. It's also about growth and rebirth, and the changing of life and things like that. So
Right.
it just felt thematically like,
Just the cyclical aspects of nature fit perfect, and to throw that at the end makes total sense to me as a listener.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So that's sort of why that sort of came in there, and I'm really glad that you like that song. It's one of my favorite things that I've ever done with Willow Tea. So.
Before I dive into another one of your projects, I don't want to lose the track here. You mentioned moving to Germany, and that's something you told me on the post show as well. Can you put into words any ways that that's affected your music and art process, if it has? Aside from maybe just being in a better mood for the weather?
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me for a second.
No worries.
I hope
It seems very relevant. It seems like you've German comes up in your music a lot, and it seems like it's just had a big impact on you there.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of personal aspects that sort of come into that. Like I mean, moving to another country is always a significant event. I mean, I've only done it once in my life, and it is going to affect you in some way. So I had come to Germany on a holiday maybe 15 years ago, I think. And I really liked it when I was here, like quite a lot. And I went around a lot of different cities, of varying sort of sizes and cultures. And sort of when I got to Berlin, it felt very familiar, but very unfamiliar to me in a way. So it's a very multicultural city. It's very similar to like the bigger cities in Australia, like Sydney and Melbourne, tend to be very multicultural very multicultural cities as well. So, and I'd gone from Munich, which is sort of like, let's say, with all respect to Munich, it is a beautiful city. It's a very wealthy city. It's a very German city. It's super German, and it's what a lot of people think of when they think of German. So they think of people with lederhosen, people drinking at Oktoberfest, for instance, and they have this wonderful old town as well, and everyone drives these immaculate BMWs and things like this. So it's very much the German sort of cliche when you come here as an outsider. And I went from that to Berlin, and Berlin is raw compared to that. Like it's in my professional life, I spend a lot of time talking to people who want to move to Germany. And, I'm always sort of saying to them constantly, Berlin is probably the least German city in Germany. it's very it's very multicultural. It's very sort of art driven. It's just very, very different in a lot of ways to Munich or Hamburg or places like this. And when I arrived in Berlin on my 3-day visit 15 years ago, it just felt like the kind of place I would like to be. And then strange twists of fate actually led me to living here. And I can't say it has specifically influenced making art or making music or anything like that. Maybe not sort of consciously, but it's certainly on a personal level. it's
Sure, you're a different person for living there. And in the big
absolutely.
picture, I imagine that rubs off.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, I'd kind of like to dive into, I believe you pronounced it Gnornian?
Gnornian, yeah.
Gnornian, excuse me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that, I don't even know where to start. It seems like this, to me, is your most involved work of fiction with creating music. I see little tales on all the Bandcamp albums. You sent me a new album that is yet to be released and it had its own line of prose with it. Um, it seems like this very fleshed out fictional land you've created. But then at the same time, through a little searching online, I see that Gnornian seems to be this old English word for feeling or expressing grief.
Yeah.
A ton of thoughts come to my head here. Can you talk a little bit about the world that you created and maybe how it's related to your life here that you were talking about in Germany with all the different cultures and everything? And then if that old English word is relevant here, can you talk about the connection?
Yeah, certainly. So, sorry, excuse me. I don't know whether you can edit that out in post, but I've got a little bit of
no worries.
I have a little bit of a cold. So, I guess what sort of happened with Gnornian was that I think in a very similar sort of way, I had a problem I wanted to solve. So with Willow Tea, it was about the problem was that I didn't know how to use GarageBand, and I wanted to learn how to use it. I also wanted to put into practice some things that I'd been reading about composition and things like that.
Right.
And with Gnornian, there's two sort of things that came into play. One of them was that I'm an unabashed fan of Fog Weaver. Quite like
same here.
Yeah, and there's another project which I think feels very similar, even though it's coming from a different sort of aspect, and that's and I'm not sure if it's pronouncing it right, but I think it's called Eindulmedia. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
One of my all-time favorites in the genre.
Yeah, and I wanted to try and make something that I felt that was a little bit, let's say, something that's very reflective, something sort of gentle, thoughtful, sad. Sad is everything that I do, but something that had a very, let's say, sort of thinking music. Maybe was sort of the original approach. And the other thing that was going through my head at the time was that I couldn't get percussion to work compositionally or sort of in the mix for anything that I was doing, and it was sort of bothering me. So I think I even posted on in one of the Dungeon Synth groups on Facebook, just saying how do I make drums sound a little bit fuller. And I got a lot of good advice, and Francis Roberts, who did that whole How to Dungeon Synth series on YouTube.
Yes, very helpful.
Yeah, so there was a little bit of advice from Francis, and so I tried to put that into practice. And at the same time, the other thing that was floating around in my head was that I wanted to try and build on the world building that I'd done with Reväwbrø, but flesh that out a lot bigger. So Reväwbrø is very self-contained. It's like the location itself is just a little island, and there's actually a reference to it within Gnornian as well. So I'm hardly a literary giant or anything like that. I'm not exactly Tolkien, but I'm sort of, they exist in the same universe, let's say. And so I wanted to sort of, all these three things were floating around independently, and they sort of coalesced into Gnornian. And the first track that I made for Gnornian, and I'm probably going to have to check this out because I can never remember the name, was The gloaming is lit by coursing candles. So I think that's the fourth track on what became the album. And that was my original. I mean, and that's also the one that doesn't include any percussion. So it's just a very gentle melody that I thought sounded like something you could have on while you're reading a book or staring out the window or something like that.
Yeah.
And then I started building all this together into Gnornian, and because I always have about 100 things that I'm interested in at any one time, I also I'd been spending, a little bit of time just reading through the origins of words using Wiktionary. So,
Ooh, wow.
And I'd sort of stumbled onto a lot of Old English words, and part of the reason that sort of resonated with me at the time was because I'm an English speaker living in Germany, and a lot of English is a Germanic language, and it's very heavily influenced by the Saxon people, the Angles and the Saxons who went over there. So a lot of German words feel very familiar and look very familiar. And so looking at Old English words on Wiktionary, I'm like, okay, you can sort of see the halfway point between the German and the English are in the middle there. So Gnornian probably doesn't really fit that bill, but it was just a word that I like the sound of it, and I like the look of it, and
okay,
it sort of fit that sort of awkward thing that I was going through with Fjældmark and Reväwbrø,
yeah,
and looking at the meaning of it sort of helped, let's say, light a little spark in the world building area about this feeling of grief and regret.
I love that.
Yeah, so it's sort of helped it was a little bit of a catalyst for the world building.
Absolutely. And this most recent Gnornian album, the yet to be released one, actually the way that we started speaking, we were talking about odd time signatures in Dungeon Synth.
Yeah.
This one coming out, it's seems like it's entirely in odd time signatures, and I listened to it and really loved it. I think so to me, and maybe this is just an opinion, but I feel like a good song that an odd time signature track is written well is when it still flows fine, and even though something feels different, it doesn't feel wrong, and it isn't immediately apparent that the song isn't in common time. It's apparent that something's a little different.
Yeah, it's a good
I think this hit the nail on the head there. It's very good. Can you talk about that album a little? Did you have to be really intentional when writing those, or do you feel like it flowed naturally?
I had to really sit back and think about what I was going to do.
Yeah.
I really had to I'm not a planner, but I sort of, going back to that metaphor about the sandbox, I really had to think about what was going to be in the sandbox and how the elements in the sandbox were going to interact. Like, it's all very well and good to have to build a nice big castle in the sandbox, and then you have a bucket of water. But if you tip the bucket of water on the castle, it all falls apart. So thinking about, I can build this castle, but I'm going to have to do something with the water as well. So why don't I dig a hole? And I put the water in the hole. So, sorry, I'm really labouring the metaphor now. But
no, I love it.
So it was so actually making the conscious decision that everything was going to be in something other than 4/4 and something other than 3/4 was. It took a little bit of working out how things are going to work, because I don't have a compositional background. Everything I just sort of learn through curiosity. So it's like sitting down thinking one day, okay, how did they tune pianos 400 years ago? And then sort of following that sort of going down the Wikipedia hole, I think, where you just sort of you look at one article and then you suddenly find half an hour later that you have 20 tabs open in your browser. Other things you want to look at. So, and time signatures became one of those sort of things for me. So it's like, okay, I don't want to do 4/4. I don't want to do 3/4. What does 5/4 sound like? How do you structure a melody or a rhythm over over a count of 5?
It's funny what goes out the window, stuff that you kind of took for granted when you mix it up like that.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was trying to consider was how does that affect the listener? How does that affect the person on the other end? Like whether that's me or whether it's somebody else, is what is the emotional effect? What's the physical or the visceral sort of effect of having 5/4 or 7/4? Or I think I even told you. I think one of the tracks is in 13/8, and
right. I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah, and I think I put myself on a hiding to nothing trying to do that. But yeah, I mean, and one of the things I learned just through doing was that 5/4 has this sort of rushing feeling, or sort of this sort of pushing feeling, in a sense. Like you feel either that fifth beat sort of makes you feel as if either you're being pushed a little bit forward, or maybe you're being pulled along, depending on how you structure it.
See.
So, yeah, and I remember at one point I was just in utter despair about how I was going to do this, and I had been in contact with somebody who was a drummer, and I just sent them a message just saying, how do you make 5/4 work? How do you make 7/8 work? How do you do this? And then I think they never actually responded to that, which was probably a good thing. So it forced me to figure it out.
That's funny.
Yeah. So yeah, and I mean, the other thing that I also did with that was that I was determined to. Another thing to put me, let's say, to move the sandbox a little outside of my comfortable zone, was to focus on just using 5 notes and just the black keys on a keyboard, to give myself something that sort of adds an extra sort of abstract layer.
Right.
So instead of being able to think, okay, I know that this is an A, this is a C, and this is a G, and I know that they work together because of this. And actually saying, okay, it's only going to be the black keys. I don't know the names of these keys. I don't know how they work together. let's just sort of figure it out. So yeah. So I think the fact that I think I have 5 tracks on that.
Yeah, I believe that's it. 5.
The fact I managed to pull them together was. I think I was relieved.
And they're good too.
Thank you.
It's almost like a lot of times you've been mentioning bringing in a problem and then writing music to find a solution helps you write good music. I can see that with odd time signatures. You now have the problem, how do I make 5/4 or 13/8 or something work? And in solving that, you come up with a pretty musically interesting solution. And I can hear that in what you sent me a ton. I know when I was writing I Will Die a Colossus, which is in 5/4, I had the same issues where it was like, what do I even do with this 5th beat? How does it affect the overall feel? And then like, to me, the kind of the background riff came a little easier, but then when it came to percussion, it's funny you mentioned talking to a drummer. I have my friend Ryan, he does the back of Beyond. He's a very talented musician that does drums. He was kind of coaching me through is at the point where it's 5/4. What even is the back beat? I don't know. I can't just stick to the 2 and the 4 like I would. And then, gosh, when it came to soloing, to doing lead lines, that was a disaster. That was just working on the MIDI. It's nice to hear that you had similar apprehensions, and it's also nice to hear that it seems like it was very rewarding, and it seems like you're happy with what you got. And I think that the release is going to be phenomenal because it turned out really good.
Thank you. it's it was a lot of fun, and I feel like I always feel like I float around the edges of, like, when I think of what dungeon synth is, I feel like I don't really fit the music that I do. I don't know whether it really,
see.
well, it's more like I don't know whether it sort of fits, and I think that's part of why I sometimes just use the word fantasy ambient rather than sort of
Right.
dungeon synth.
Interesting.
And I feel that this one in particular might just be like a square peg in a round hole. Like I feel relatively happy with what I've done. I know that, I mean, I'm always going to sort of pick over details and things, and I've had moments where I've just entirely scrapped things altogether. I'm just like, I'm deleting this.
Really?
I'm forgetting all about it. I never want to do this again. But I mean, overall, I'm pretty content with how it came out. And since I finished that one, I've decided that I never want to go back to. Well, no, not exactly. I feel like I've sort of closed the book on that experiment in a sense. So not the odd time sickness. It's more about the doing an entire 5 songs just using the same 5
Right.
notes. I feel like I sort of exhausted what I could do with that and still make each track feel distinct.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So.
And to your point about not being sure if it's technically dungeon synth, I also think that all the time about my own music, and I feel like the community is kind of, the majority has made the decision that they're not going to be sticklers about it, that they're not going
Yeah.
to. It seems like it seems fairly open about what we're allowed to say is dungeon synth, and not every genre is like that, and
Yeah, that's true.
it's something I'm thankful for. Is there I feel like there is a pretty distinct roots to the genre, and then things have deviated quite a bit, and it seems like people are okay with it.
Yeah. And I agree. I think I mean, just looking at, I mean, where I'm sitting now, I'm just sort of looking at a wall of cassettes and just, tracing a line from, let's say, Old Foxden across to Vandalorum or Hall Dweller is, these are
Yeah.
3 quite distinctly different acts or artists. And, if a genre can include all 3 of these under its a pretty broad umbrella, then I'm happy with that. But
Right, I appreciate the flexibility,
yeah,
and I think that your music doesn't just fit into it. I think it really does add to and expand upon like the canon that we would consider dungeon synth.
yeah, absolutely.
So we've went quite a while. I'm having a blast. I feel like I want to get a couple technical questions
Yeah,
in
sure.
before we head out. Yeah, and then we can call it there. The first thing that's on my mind, you mentioned getting doing GarageBand for a lot of your work. Is that the still your go-to workstation?
Yeah, for nearly everything I do. Yeah. For Fjældmark, that sort of pre-existed the
Right.
garage
I think
band.
that you released that in like 2019 were the first releases, right?
Yeah, and that was me sort of trying to figure out this dungeon synth thing. um, I, I knew about the music, but it was me just sort of saying, "Can I do something like this? Can I make something like this?" And at the time, I just sort of used some other software. I have a MIDI keyboard that I'd had for a few years that was gathering dust, and it came
I
with
see.
some fairly basic software, but it has an interesting instrument set. So like very natural sounding instruments, and Yeah, so Fjældmark is mostly that weird software plus and it's not built for composition, like it's built for making little phrases. So so Fjældmark was all about building, let's say, little sentences and putting them together in Audacity and trying to glue them together into a sentence that makes sense, like a paragraph that makes sense. And
oh, that's beautiful.
I don't know that I was very successful with a lot of that, which is why Fjældmark is sort of. I mean, there are a couple of things there that I'm really happy about, like Dimmerworld was something I did a couple of years ago, which was.
I would say that's my favorite of the Fjældmark releases.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that's probably where I felt Fjældmark sort of, at least for me, making it. That's where I felt like everything sort of came together well. But now, I mean, it's not a project on hiatus, but it's one that I need to sort of think about how to re-access that.
I see.
That thinking to build that again. Sorry, that's going a little bit off on the tangent.
No, there's nothing to stick to. Any answer you have is appreciated. And with Fjældmark, I mean, using a whole different system has to help you maintain an original sound, I imagine.
Yeah, it was with Fjældmark. It was a lot of frustration in making that music.
Because of technical limitations?
Yeah, absolutely. So like trying to make these little phrases or sentences that I was using this software to build, and then trying to put them into Audacity and make them actually fit together and glue them together. I listened to some of the tracks that I made, and I just think, oh, you can hear where the seams are. Like,
I see.
And it's really glaringly obvious to me, and so I had to try and do a lot of, let's say, throwing a lot of glitter at it to try and hide those cracks in the work. So there's a lot of work that I did for that I'm not very satisfied with, but it was a good playground, let's say, for a while. But Dimmerworld, I think, came together well.
With your GarageBand work, what do you find yourself doing to get kind of that? Is you have this grittier, old school sound. I especially note it on the Willow Tea releases. Is that an instrument selection thing, or is that something that you do in post to the final song after it's done? If you run it through some sort of chain, I guess if you could picture the signature Willow Tea sound, could you talk a little bit about how you get that?
Yeah, and it's. I hope I'm not going to sort of pull the rug from under people here, but it's literally just one instrument in GarageBand, which is it's just a Mellotron synthesizer. So that's my sandbox. I think I sometimes incorporate other sounds from other parts of GarageBand, but ultimately the qualities in Willow Tea come from basically just using the Mellotron synthesizer in there. So it has a Mellotron is like it's an old keyboard based instrument that uses cassettes to play back. And I really apologize for people who know more about this than I do. That uses cassettes or magnetic tape to play back a particular sound. So when you hit a key, it'll play back maybe like a little reel of magnetic tape that says, okay, this is the flute sound, or this is the cello sound. And the thing that sort of appeals to me about this is because it's very lo-fi anyway, and it breaks easily. So the more you sort of push the Mellotron synthesizers in GarageBand, the rougher they sort of sound. So for instance, for the cello, if you take that right down to the lower registers, it has a very, it almost sounds like a tractor or something like that. And with the
tractor,
with the
that's funny.
The flute sounds, the higher you take that, the more distorted and sort of
right.
more it sort of starts to peak. And it can start to sound very bad very quickly, but you just sort of ride that line. That's
good. I think that the flexibility there in pushing it to get different textures can kind of explain how, despite using one instrument, you have a pretty good handle on textures within the releases there. I think that feels like every frequency is well represented, and it fits nicely in my ears.
Excellent. Good.
Great. Well, we're really cooking. It's been like an hour and 5 already. I think that this is a good place to stop. I think we got just a ton of cool, thought-provoking background and information. Also, you have a voice for podcasting. You could look into audiobooks or something like that. It's so soothing.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say before we head out?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I mean, obviously I need to plug.
Right. Go crazy with that.
So, I mean, I don't have any, I've really only got one sort of release plan, but that's through Gulick Records. There's Dimmer World, which I was mentioning earlier, is getting a cassette release.
No way!
I think it's later this month. I need to check exactly when that's going
to happen.
Will it
keep the original cover, or are you doing a new cover?
No, it'll keep the same cover. It's just like
I love that cover so much.
Yeah, isn't that awesome? Like, it's just I really like let's say inaccurate anatomical diagrams of
right. Yeah. That's great.
So I mean, that sort of fit as well, like that sort of pulpy aspect of Dino-Synth. But so that's getting a release later this month, and we'll be using the same artwork later this month, maybe next month. We'll see.
Okay.
Yeah, but otherwise, I mean, I'm still sort of working on a lot of things, and we have the Gnornian, so that is going to be part of a split, but we've sort of pushed that back a little bit. The other person on the split is also has a lot on their plate at the moment, so we just sort of said, okay, let's just wait a little bit.
So no firm date there?
No.
Okay, just something to keep our eyes peeled.
Yeah, and I tend to be a very impulsive sort of releaser of music, so maybe something will just sort of pop up on the 31st of October because Halloween. Who knows?
Oh, true. Yeah, you're the Willow Tea on Instagram, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so I imagine if something's gonna pop up kind of impulsively, as you said, that would maybe be if you just want a one-stop shop to keep track of things like that. Is that the place?
Yeah. So that's my one-stop shop for Willow Tea plus let's say everything else music oriented. Yeah.
Excellent. Anything else you'd like to plug?
No, nothing in particular.
Okay. I'll throw all your bandcamp links in it, by the way. I know there's a lot to keep up with for the listeners. Their link tree has Willow Tea, Gnornian, Fjældmark, the Orb Weaver, and Reväwbrø.
Yeah, I mean, are you really taking yourself seriously as dungeon synth artists if you don't have at least 7 different projects?
Right, that is the trend that I notice. I got to step it up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we'll get out of here. Thank you so much again for coming on. This has just been such a fun talk.
Excellent. Cool. Well, yeah, likewise. It's been a lot of fun chatting, and yeah, let's yeah.
Yeah, there we go. We'll certainly keep in touch.
Yeah.
And thanks so much to the listeners for hanging out and listening in. I think this was a good one.
Cool.
All right. Catch you later.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, friends, that was great. That was just an absolute pleasure. I'm so happy to have had Wayne on the show. I love when the interview covers everything like that. Like, I feel like we got to see behind the scenes from so many different angles here. Really getting a look into Wayne's life, musical and non-musical, and learning how so many different aspects of that life came together to influence all of their projects. It really changes the way that I listen to their music, and that's good because I've just been completely binging Wayne's albums this past week. I'll go ahead and reiterate all of their projects here, just so you can be sure that you don't miss anything. So Wayne is responsible for Willow Tea, Gnornian, Fjældmark, Reväwbrø, and the Orb Weaver. You can check all those out on Bandcamp. If all those links are too tough to keep track of, you can just check out linktr.ee/thewillowtea, and you can find everything that they do there in one place. You can also check out their Instagram, which is that's also The Willow Tea, all one word, The Willow Tea. That page kind of serves as a hub for everything that Wayne does. Definitely good to hop on that, follow them, see what you can see. I know they've got a ton of new releases and some tapes and things like that on the horizon. So yeah, I really urge you folks to just check those links out. And then as always, you can keep up with me and with my work at Castbitten_ on Instagram or at Castbitten on YouTube and on Bandcamp. You can stream my music and my podcast anywhere that you would normally listen to those things. All of that. I'm really, really happy to announce that those Castbitten shirts are in fact for sale. You can go get them right now. It's so nice. It's nice to have a big box of these stupid things and to hold them and look at them. If you want one, you can find them on castbitten.bandcamp.com/merch. You can buy the shirts right there. If you don't want to use Bandcamp to purchase it for whatever reason, that's totally fine. Just I don't know, reach out, get in touch with me on that Instagram or through the Bandcamp contact link, and we can figure out something there. The shirts are really cool. I'm wearing mine right now as we speak. I wore it to the farmer's market today. I walked around town with it. This is great. It's got me just grinning ear to ear. They've got the Castbitten cover art on them that Crack Draws did, and they're high quality. They fit well, and I seriously mean that. Like, I didn't want to get the cheap band shirts with like the big wonky sleeves and the big belly and all that. I feel like a lot of times I buy those because I'm psyched on music or something, and then I don't end up wearing it because they look weird, and I didn't want that. I don't know. Wanted to bring a little bit for something that I feel like I'd wear around. So if you live in the US, they're just $23, and that's everything. That includes shipping and taxes. If you're outside of the US, it gets kind of weird, and I totally don't know what I'm doing, so I just put a high number on Bandcamp for shipping, because I didn't want to get in a situation where it's really expensive and I'm losing anything on it. But if you get in touch with me, I live like 300 feet from the post office, so I can just go down and ask what shipping's gonna be, and we can work it out there. So yeah, shirts rule, Dungeon Synth rules, things are going great, everything's wonderful. It's nice out. I hope everyone's having a lovely weekend. It's getting really chilly here, and as Wayne and I talked about, that's kind of nice. I like it. I've been going outside a ton to enjoy it, going out in the woods, on the lake, all of that. Would recommend. It's been great. But alright everyone, I'm rambling here. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening. I say that every week, but I truly mean it. Take care. Have a good weekend. Get out of here.